I want to talk about grammar schools now. So we said earlier you were educated at grammar school, and then you resigned from David Cameron's front bench over grammar schools, and and haven't found your way back to the front bench, at least not yet anyway. So clearly an important issue to you. I want to put this, if you don't mind, in a slightly Northern Irish context for our audience, which is to say that in Northern Ireland, the grammar school system is much more widespread than it is in the UK. So it was sort of 1960s comprehensive education started to take hold in the UK. But I mean, in Northern Ireland, there was a government-run transfer test up until 2008. To the 45% of students in Northern Ireland attend grammar schools. In England, it's probably closer to around 5%. So it's a massive difference there between those two, the experiences in England and in Northern Ireland. So that, that grammar school debate is very much alive in Northern Ireland, perhaps even more so than it is in England. I want to kind of start at the very beginning because this is an interesting topic for a lot of people. Why are you so in favour of grammar schools? I mean, what's your kind of pitch on why grammar schools are a good thing?
Well, I suppose I'd start off from my own perspective, my own experience. I think it gave me great opportunities, and it gives a lot of other people opportunities they might not otherwise have. And I think the way in which the grammar schools, when they were more prevalent, were helping to break down social barriers in the United Kingdom, were helping to make sure that there was a much better mix. The upper reaches of the judiciary, or the permanent secretaries in Whitehall, the senior partners of law firms, whatever they might be. If you look at all of those categories, you find back in the late 60s, early 70s, there were actually fewer who were public school educated, because the grammar schools had been making massive inroads and breaking down some of those social barriers. And that's certainly been my experience. So that's one thing. The second thing I look at is the way the system works in my own part of the country, the borough of Trafford. But the same is true in Northern Ireland, in that Trafford has got essentially a wholly selective system, and so has Northern Ireland. And we actually have better results across the piece than do most areas which have gone comprehensive. And that's not just the grammar schools. It's the grammar schools and the high schools added together get better results than most comprehensive sectors do. And certainly, if you then remove the benefits of more affluent areas, you look at the schools that are the most socially selective in the country, and Sutton Trust, which does all that very good social mobility work, has looked at this. All of the most socially selective state schools in the country are actually comprehensive schools. They're comprehensive schools in the wealthiest catchments anywhere in the country, where essentially if your parents can't afford to buy a house in the right place, you don't go to that school. And it's a long time ago now, but not long after I resigned in 2007, I came over a couple of times to Northern Ireland. I was invited to speak at some of the grammar schools and do a bit of media on the subject, because I was always struck there was a terrible kind of lack of self-confidence about Northern Ireland's system. And I just kept pointing out to people how it compared in terms of its results to the English education system in most places. And it came as a great revelation. So all too often Northern Ireland does itself down when it's doing something better than other people are. And the final point I make is just that I would say we should have a great diverse pattern of education. You should have all sorts of different schools, and grammar schools should be a part of that. You should have the same kind of opportunities for a diverse offer in education in the state sector as you can if you can afford to pay for it.
I suppose the problem, and you mentioned affluence there, and these are the common arguments. You will have heard this before. In Northern Ireland, for example, schools possess around a third as many students on free school meals, grammar schools, a third as many students on free school meals as the wider population. And you mentioned the Sutton Trust, same thing in England. They say the figures outweigh down to 3% of students in grammar schools on free school meals. I mean, aren't those fairly clear indications that the grammar school system perhaps unless it's deployed everywhere, it disproportionately benefits kids from a wealthy background. And in some ways, there's a logic to that. I mean, parents can pay for tutoring, they can pay for all the devices that you need as a young kid to do well. And we've seen that, in the COVID pandemic, to do with devices and learning from home and all this kind of stuff. Does the grammar school system not disproportionately benefit kids from wealthy backgrounds? Is that not the bottom line?
If you look at Northern Ireland's education system, it's also true that you do far better than the rest of the country does in terms of having fewer people who emerge from education without any qualifications at all. So, I think there's an important argument there that says the system as a whole is delivering rather better than many other places. But I think you do put your finger on an important issue. Different maybe in North Kent and places like that, which happen to be less affluent. The whole county kept its grammar schools. In the context of something like Trafford, it is a problem we struggle with precisely because there are no grammar schools in leafier Cheshire to the south. There are no grammar schools in more urban Manchester to the north. So there is a pressure from people wanting to come across the borough boundaries to get to our schools. And that is a constant difficulty for us. It would be alleviated, if not entirely solved, if we could get more grammar schools where people want them.
Let me ask two questions on this from Grace. The first is a very simple question, I suppose, for proponents of grammar schools. Is it fair to judge a child's potential at the age of 10? You've talked about the benefit that you've derived from grammar school. I mean, why should a child who's just a little bit further behind, but will or may catch up, be deprived of that experience? That's our first question. And the second one is, you attended an all-boys school and a grammar school. What's your opinion on education being segregated according to gender? So you've got sort of academic ability there and gender. What about that first one? Is it fair to judge a child's potential at the age of 10 through a test or two tests?
Well, the most important thing I would say is you make sure that all of the schools are good schools, so that what you're doing really is trying to find the most appropriate school for the child rather than a kind of 1950s, 60s view of the world where it was a pass or fail view of the world. I don't think there is a single age that's obviously right for transfer, and certainly there used to be much more commonly 11 plus and 13 plus movement between the schools. I think that's perfectly reasonable to have more movement over a longer period of time. The problem is, of course, if the other schools are good, people tend to settle in them, and it doesn't necessarily become a big issue for them. So I now want to go to the grammar school. But I wouldn't say a particular age to choose, nor would I stipulate a particular way of selecting. But I think there is a lot that can be done by trying to make sure the tests that are used are as fair as possible, as open as possible, and also that you try to make sure there's enough kind of outreach. And one of the things that troubles me in a lot of places in England that have got grammar schools, especially where it's not universal, the primary schools often don't give any experience of the kind of tests that kids are going to have to sit. And it's one of the things, my old school, Altrincham Boys, which is part of a multi-academy trust of which I am a member. And I'm pleased one of the things we're working on now is to try to make sure we have the best outreach to make sure that people, especially from less advantaged parts of the community, are able to have a fair chance of getting to the school. We're doing that by offering support to some of those areas. And also we've now changed the entry test to one which is deemed less susceptible to tutoring.
That's an interesting point, actually, because I know tutoring is a big issue. The other thing and the reason it's on my mind, Sir Graham, is because we've been having a big conversation about this in Northern Ireland, about how grammar schools should now select students because the tests were cancelled. The other thing that comes up quite often is, by definition, if some kids are going to a grammar school and some are going to a comprehensive, there needs to be a test of some kind. Is it right, do you think? You're clearly somebody who's got a lot of self-confidence. You need to if you're going to be an MP, really. Is it fair to tell a young child at a young age or whatever age, no, you failed, you can't make it into a grammar school, you need to go elsewhere? Or am I framing the entire system incorrectly?
I think you are, and I think the danger is that those who oppose selection very often choose to frame it in that way in order to try to make their case. You can understand why they do that, but in doing so, that's, I think, where the message can come across, that you either succeed by going to the grammar school or you fail by going to another school. And I always make the case, we've got in my constituency high schools, the non-grammar schools, which are outstanding schools. An example, Ashton-on-Mersey High School, which is sponsored by Manchester United, which educates the Manchester United juniors as well. It's got a very good reputation. A school like Wellington School in Timperley, in my constituency, again, these are very good schools. And I think as long as you've got that recognition that there are a number of different schools with different specialisms and different things that recommend them, I think the system works well. And certainly it would be wrong to give the message to children to say they've failed because they're not going to grammar school. There are lots of people who don't go to grammar school, who go to good schools and have other opportunities and go on to university in just the same way.
Okay, and what about that question to do with segregated education according to gender? You went to an all-boys school. What's your perspective on that?
I don't know. I think I would say that it's certainly in the context of what I see in my local schools now, it's less of an issue probably than it was when I was at school, because there's a lot more interaction between the schools. There's more, some of it organised social interaction, school plays that are collaborative. So, I don't think it is a huge problem. I think in some ways, like with many other things in life, the question, how would you change it, is a really tricky one. And certainly you couldn't change it by having either the boys or the girls school deciding that it would take both. It would have to be a joint decision, and those things are a little bit harder.